History provides a great library on despotic rulers, tyrants and dictators who ruled by fear and terror. Few nations can lay claim to not being held in the grip of at least one of these self-appointed political messiahs. The Muslim world at large, and the Arab world in particular, has its own collection of misanthropes who, over many centuries, abused their own people and subjugated millions for personal gain and power. In Iraq, the people suffered decades under one man who embodied all that is evil, as well as his two sons, who were just as cruel. Who was Saddam Hussein? Where did he come from? How did he gain power? What were his crimes? How did he remain in power for so long? And what happened to him? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937 in Al-Aja, a village near the city of Tikrit in northern Iraq, to peasant farmers. And that was one of the poorest regions of the country. His father died before he was born, so as a boy he went to live with an uncle in Baghdad. His family were Sunni Arabs, who were a minority in the country and still are to this day. Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party in 1957 and was a devout anarchist, and in 1959, he was involved in the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate the Iraqi Prime Minister Abdel Karim Qassim, who was believed to be in collaboration with the United States Central Intelligence Agency and Egyptian intelligence. Saddam had been recruited late by the ringleader Abdul Karim al-Shikli, after one man left the group. During the ambush, Saddam was wounded in the exchange on October 7th after he began shooting prematurely, the gunfire killing Qassim's chauffeur, and Qassim himself was hit in the arm and shoulder. The would-be killers then fled, thinking that they had in fact killed Qassim, but he survived. The failed assassination attempt would become blown out of proportion by Saddam, and he created a massive heroic narrative to increase his popularity, expand his myth, making himself the outstanding hero of the event. Saddam and some of the others managed to escape to Syria and then to Egypt, protected by Gamal Abdel Nasser, and while there he attended Cairo Law School. Upon his return home, he continued studying at Baghdad Law College, after the Ba'athists took power in Iraq in 1963. During this time, Saddam made contact with U.S. officials in Cairo, establishing a relationship with American intelligence. When the Ba'athists were overthrown that same year, Saddam was arrested for his plot in the coup and spent almost 3 years in Abu Ghraib prison, but he managed to escape. In 1966, he joined the Iraqi and Baghdad-based Ba'ath parties and was involved in the coup that brought the party back to power in 1968. Saddam was appointed vice president by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and he effectively held power even as VP, and he played a key role in the 17 July Revolution, and in 1972 he nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company. Saddam managed the Second Iraq-Kurdish War of 1974-75, gaining followers, and Saddam was in total control after al-Bakr's resignation in 1979. Saddam also became chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council and prime minister, among other positions rolled all into one office. Saddam admired former Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who fought both the French and British over the Suez Canal in 1956, united Egypt, and was considered the man who created the modern Arab League with his alliance with Syria, which later included Jordan. Saddam had openly stated that he wanted to supersede Egypt as the leader of the Arab world and to achieve hegemony over the Persian Gulf. But he also knew that he had to have complete blind loyalty among the military. In a purge reminiscent of Joseph Stalin, he purged the military of high-ranking officers who he felt were less than loyal, replacing them with family members and acolytes who were not exactly prepared for such positions. Once in position as ruler for only 6 days, his purge into the Ba'ath Party began when he held a massive meeting on July 22, 1979, of all the party faithful in a local theater in Baghdad. Saddam took the stage, shuffled through some papers, taking his time, building up the suspense. Then one of his loyal men came on stage and stated that a plot to remove Saddam from power had just been uncovered. After a few minutes of silence, Saddam said, "All the guilty parties are in this room right now." There was a visible air of nervousness among the more than 100 in attendance. Then Saddam called Ba'ath Party member Mu'i Abdel Hussein Mashhadi, a member of the Revolutionary Command Council who had previously disagreed with Saddam on an issue in a policy meeting, and he walked up to the stage. Mashhadi then stunned the crowd as he began confessing to his role in the plot to overthrow Saddam. In the meantime, Saddam sat down at the long table and lit a cigar, smiling in victory. Mashhadi continued and stated, "I was the one behind the plot. It was me who tried getting others to join in." Mashhadi, in fact, actually had nothing to do with the plot, which in fact probably never existed. But he had been tortured and coerced to admit to his crimes to save his family. He was told explicitly that his wife and daughter would be raped in front of him if he did not become the fall guy. After Mashhadi was led away, Saddam again took the podium, relit his cigar, and savored the moment. Then he said, "What means should be used against these traitors? You know the answer. There is no other way than the sword." The very nervous audience exploded in frantic applause, as if each were trying to clap louder than those around him. Then Saddam again addressed the crowd. "When I have read out your name, you shall stand up, recite the party slogan, and leave the room." Saddam then took his time and read from a list of 68 names, and each man stood, recited the slogan, and was led away to an uncertain future. One of those whose name was called stood and asked why his name was called. Apparently, he knew nothing about and had nothing to do with this. Saddam never addressed him directly, but repeated his previous instructions. The man, still puzzled, then left the room. Saddam then finished reading from the list, and more men stood and left. These were to be the sacrificial lambs to publicly exert his power. Once Saddam was finished, the remaining men, obviously quite relieved to have not been randomly selected as scapegoats, started an even more frantic round of clapping and cheering, showering their complete praise and support for Saddam Hussein. Saddam even took out his handkerchief to apparently wipe away tears of regret for his actions. It was all a show. Those 68 who walked out were arrested and placed into trucks to be taken to prison. Over the next week, all were tried in very quick yet separate trials and found guilty of treason, and 22 of those men, including 5 members of the Revolutionary Command Council, were sentenced to death. The events were publicized on July 28, 1979 in Iraqi media, which began accusing Syria of backing the alleged plot. Syrian Baathists responded by denying any relations to the coup plotters. Syria denied any knowledge of the coup whatsoever. To add insult to injury, Saddam personally chose the executioners, all members of the Ba'ath Party. The executioners and condemned all gathered in the supposed building where the mythical coup was planned. The men Saddam chose were not professionals. Many had never fired a weapon before. When they entered the courtyard and were handed a weapon, each killer was given a blindfolded victim on his knees, awaiting his fate. Outside the compound, Saddam's associates had organized a crowd of thousands, all carrying signs, shouting slogans, who believed the story. Their shouts of support for Saddam were the last things the victims heard before the shots that took their lives. This was well orchestrated to display Saddam's power and provide a warning to anyone thinking of trying to challenge his authority in the future. The crowd heard the shots. However, the haphazard amateurish execution saw several victims shot more than once due to their executioners being too nervous and inexperienced. But the job was finally done, and Saddam had established his power and instilled fear as he wanted. On August 8th, the Iraqi news agency announced that 21 of the 22 Iraqis executed by firing squad for their part in a plot to overthrow Iraq's new president. According to the Iraqi news agency, the 22nd and last man was condemned to death in absentia because he was nowhere to be found. A tape of both the party assembly and of the executions was distributed throughout the country, and shortly afterward, in early August 1979, Saddam Hussein took to the balcony of the presidential mansion in Baghdad to inform a chanting crowd of 50,000 supporters that he had just witnessed the punishment the state court had ordered for 21 of those men. He informed them that these traitors had been executed by a firing squad. The crowd cheered. To enforce his reign of terror, he extensively used the secret police to suppress all opposition to his rule and made himself the object of an extensive personality cult among the Iraqi public. However, under Saddam, religious tolerance was expanded, with Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together without any regional sectarian violence happening elsewhere. But that also caused some friction. Shia militants, with Shiites being the majority of the country, were not on board with this platform, and they hated Saddam. Feeling a lot of pressure from the 4/5 majority of Shiites in Iraq, supported by Iran, Saddam launched the invasion of Iran, ostensibly to capture Iran's Arab-majority Khuzestan province and punish Iran for interfering in his hostile takeover and stirring up Shiite resistance, as well as supporting the Kurds against Iraq. Iraqi forces targeted the oil fields in the September 1980 attack, but the military campaign bogged down into a war of attrition, where everything was on the table, including gas warfare. Saddam's newly appointed field commanders were not up to the task. The war lasted until 1988 and cost both nations heavily in oil exports. Iran was already on sanctions, but Iraq's losses, combined with Iran's of over 1 million, caused Saddam to scale down his ambitious programs for economic development. With both nations exhausted and over 1 million deaths, both countries agreed to a ceasefire. Ironically, despite his losses and massive foreign indebtedness, Saddam continued to build up his armed forces. Then, as if to maintain some image of power, Saddam ordered the Anfal campaign against Kurdish rebels who had sided with Iran, an operation that was recognized by Human Rights Watch and the United Nations as an act of genocide, when he authorized poison gas and nerve agents to be deployed. On March 16, 1988, the Kurdish town of Halabja was attacked with a mix of mustard gas and nerve agents, probably sarin, and during the Halabja massacre, Saddam killed between 3,200 and 5,000 people and injured 7,000 to 10,000 more, mostly civilians. Saddam was given cover by the U.S. government, who laid blame for that massacre on Iran. The international estimates are that between 50 and 100,000 people were killed, while Kurdish sources themselves estimate that 182,000 Kurds were killed. In August 1990, Saddam had charged that neighboring Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil through slant drilling across the border. This may have actually been going on. He also claimed Kuwait was a breakaway 19th province of the original Iraqi state, so to reclaim it, he invaded Kuwait, with the intention of using that nation's oil reserves to revitalize the Iraqi economy. But his occupation of Kuwait quickly triggered a worldwide trade embargo against Iraq. Saddam ignored international demands and a UN resolution to withdraw from Kuwait. He still refused, even as a coalition force deployed to Saudi Arabia in Operation Desert Shield. Saddam allowed his soldiers to commit crimes against the Kuwaiti people, including theft, rape, murder, and crimes that I will not discuss here during their occupation of Kuwait. The Persian Gulf War on January 16, 1991, which ended 6 weeks later when the Allied forces drove Iraq out of Kuwait, then triggered internal rebellions by both Shiites and Kurds, but Saddam suppressed their uprisings, causing thousands to flee to refugee camps along the country's northern border. Thousands more were tortured and murdered, with many disappearing into the prison system. Entire towns and villages were wiped out. Nasir al-Hussein, who was only 12 at the time of the 1991 mass arrest, was there. He, his mother, uncle, and cousins were piled on buses. They turned off onto a farm road, and the execution started. People were thrown into a pit, machine-gunned, and then buried with a bulldozer. Nasser, remarkably unhit, crawled out of the mass grave, leaving his dead relatives behind. But not everybody involved was actually on board. A colonel in charge of intelligence objected to the killing and said, "The regime is on the verge of collapse. Why execute people?" So he was executed as the smell of decaying bodies wafted through the blazing heat. Due to Saddam's prevalence for using chemical weapons, as part of the ceasefire agreement with the UN, Iraq was prohibited from producing or possessing chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. These were supported by massive sanctions against Iraq to enforce compliance, which destroyed the economy. But Saddam, afraid of losing face in the Arab world, continued refusing to cooperate with UN arms inspectors, which led to a 4-day airstrike by the United States and Great Britain in late 1998 called Operation Desert Fox. Both nations supported efforts of the Iraqi opposition to remove Saddam from power, but Saddam then barred the UN weapons inspectors under Hans Blix, who had already discovered and destroyed several tons of chemical weapons, from re-entering Iraq. Saddam did receive some support from the Arab world, as they saw him as the strong man willing to stand up to the Western nations despite his intolerable human rights abuses. But the Iraqi people were also suffering from the activities of his two sons, Uday and Qusay. These monsters had no restraint upon their actions. They raped, abused, and tortured at will. In fact, according to one of Uday's bodyguards, quote, "It was his recreational pastime." End quote. When sports teams, especially the soccer team, did badly, there was horror to follow. According to the reports, quoting, "Jailers often treated allegedly lagging players in ways certain to hurt, not improve, the athletes' performances on the field. After shaving their heads to humiliate them, athletes were hung upside down and the soles of their feet whipped. They were buried in hot sand up to their necks. Their fingers or ears were amputated. Electric shocks were applied to their skin and genitals, and in the case of soccer players, they were forced to kick concrete balls." This particular type of punishment meted out of the soccer players was extreme, especially after Iraq lost to the United States in an international match. Players were beaten, some were killed, many crippled, dragged across hot asphalt, forced into sewers. Some saw their wives and daughters gang raped in front of them and murdered. Some victims were fed alive to Uday's two lions. One woman, 7 months pregnant, was beheaded in violation of Islamic law on Uday's order. Once a doctor being held in prison refused to speak during interrogation. They brought in his 3-month-old daughter, and after plucking out both of her eyes, grabbed her by the ankles and smashed her head against the wall. Uday would often have his men kidnap women he liked off the street for rape parties. His brother Qusay did the same thing. In fact, quoting one of the women who reported on this, quote, "One of his preferred forms of torture," she said, "was to order the women to strip, then tie them to the tree trunk. and smear wet sugar on them so the dogs would terrorize them as they lifted off their bodies. Hanna also identified his superior at the academy. One dark joke in Iraq was that there was not much place to farm new crops because of all the mass graves. Prisoners were often eliminated with a bullet to the head, but one witness told the London-based human rights group Indict that inmates were sometimes murdered by being dropped into shredding machines. Some prisoners went in head first and died quickly, while others were put in feet first and died screaming. The witness said that, on at least one occasion, Kuwait supervised shredding machine murders. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks against the U.S. government, believing that Saddam would hand over his remaining weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. ordered Saddam to allow the inspectors back in. Saddam did allow UN weapons inspectors to return to Iraq in November of 2002, but he failed to comply with the investigations and allow full access. These events caused the United States and Great Britain to declare an end to diplomacy. The final straw came on March 17, 2003, when President George W. Bush ordered Saddam to step down from office and leave Iraq within 48 hours or face war. Bush also stated that, even if Saddam left the country, U.S. forces might be needed to stabilize the new government and search for weapons of mass destruction. When Saddam refused to leave, a new allied coalition of U.S. and European forces invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003. Despite his rhetoric to his people and his touting his military capabilities, Baghdad fell to U.S. soldiers on April 9, and Saddam went into hiding, taking the bulk of the national treasury with him, and he was able to evade capture along with his sons by U.S. troops for quite a while. His sadistic sons, Uday and Qusay, were killed in Mosul on July 22nd, but it was not until December 13th that Saddam was finally captured. The once dapper leader was pulled, disheveled, and dirty from a small underground hiding place near a farmhouse in the vicinity of Tikrit. Although he was armed, Saddam surrendered to U.S. soldiers without firing a shot. In October 2005, Saddam Hussein went on trial before the Iraqi High Tribunal, a panel court established to try officials of the former Iraqi government. Many of these men or their families in the court had been victims of the Hussein family. It had been decided that, instead of hauling Saddam before the World Court in The Hague, where there could be no death sentence, the Iraqis themselves would conduct a trial and mete out justice. Saddam faced a lot of charges, and several of his co-defendants were charged with several crimes, including mass murder, torture, and grand theft, crimes against humanity. But one specifically was the killing of 148 townspeople in the mainly Shiite town of al-Dujail in 1982 due to the large number of eyewitnesses. Throughout the 9-month trial, Saddam interrupted the proceedings with angry outbursts, claiming that the tribunal was a sham and that U.S. interests were behind it. The court finally adjourned in July 2006 and handed down its verdicts in November. Saddam was convicted of crimes against humanity, including willful killing, illegal imprisonment, deportation, and torture, and was sentenced to death by hanging. Saddam's half-brother, an intelligence officer and Iraq's former chief judge, were also sentenced to death. Days after an Iraqi court upheld his sentence on appeal, Saddam was executed on December 30, 2006. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.